Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Mankiewicz. We are celebrating science fiction all month on TCM. And tonight, to discuss a selection of the best sci-fi films of the 1950s, we welcome a longtime fan of the genre and a good friend of ours here at TCM, the writer, director of The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, and The Mist, Frank Darabont. Frank, welcome back. Great to see you again.
Thank you for inviting me back. I was very happy that you did.
A couple years ago, you and I sat, we did a month of prison films, and afterwards you said, yeah, that was great. When do I get to come back to talk about sci-fi?
That's right.
Sci-fi, that's from the time you were a kid, that's been your thing.
That's right. I love all genres.
Right.
Big fan of noir, big fan of westerns, all of them, but the special love. We all have a special love, and for me it was always science fiction, the cinema and the literature of the fantastic. And I don't know why. It's a genetic predisposition, but ever since my brother took me to see my very first movie, and for most people my age, that was Mary Poppins, but for me, that was Robinson Crusoe on Mars. It was the very first movie I saw in a theater. My big brother Andy took me to see it, the World Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, and it was in color, and it was big, and it blew my mind. And I've just, it's like a delicious thing to me, this genre.
Next film you've picked tonight, very significant sci-fi film, The War of the Worlds from 1953. What got you about The War of the Worlds?
It was the humanity of the characters, the desperation, the circumstances, and yet trying to rise to the occasion, trying to, trying to overcome, trying to survive even. And the sheer unstoppable, relentless march of the Martian war machines and that whole very slow process of just destroying everything in their path.
Including, as you mentioned, sort of it leads to this breakdown of humanity. We see Los Angeles sort of fall apart into a widespread panic and looting.
Yes, which are still, by the way, even by contemporary standards, very effective sequences, very scary. Just to see the empty streets of a major city, is that alone is a haunting image. But those scenes with the mobs and the trucks and just the sheer terror. Even at the age of 5, when I first saw this movie, I thought, yeah, that would pretty much happen. The
director here is Byron Askin, the stars Gene Barry and Ann Robinson, but the real creative force behind it is the producer, George Pal. How important is George Pal to the development of science fiction?
I think given War of the Worlds and The Time Machine,
which he directed 7 years later.
Which were both adaptations of very formative works of literature. I think they became very formative works of cinema, and his imprint is all over that. George Pal, who came to this country as an immigrant, indeed as a refugee, I believe.
That's right.
From my homeland.
Hungary, right?
Hungary, exactly. So that was, for me growing up, George Pal's films were a source of pride. I always felt a little special connection to his work, to him and his work because of that. But you can see that his imagination was very potent.
Given the rudimentary special effects available in 1953, Gordon Jennings won the Oscar for Best Special Effects. He died shortly after production, got the award posthumously. There's a challenge of how much you can show, right, of the Martians. What, as a director, what is that process of how do I scare people without creating something that causes people to laugh, that undermines the seriousness of the movie you're making?
It's not only what you show, it's what you choose not to show. Given that it was 1953, the effects work in this movie, I mean, yeah, sure, you see the strings. You have to look past the fact that this was made over half a century ago, but the effects are really good. I mean, it's deserved. I believe that Oscar was deserved because the effects in this are really first class, and the design work is so deeply memorable. I mean, given H.G. Wells' description of the war machines, the tripods that strode over the landscape, they couldn't really do that back then. But what they came up with as an alternative is just as memorable. I mean, those Martian war machines are embedded in the brains of anybody who ever saw that movie who went on to become filmmakers. And by the way, they recycled those models. They took the necks off, but they recycled those models for Robinson Crusoe on Mars, which was the first science fiction movie I ever saw.
Good way to wrap it up.
There you go.
Frank Darabont, thanks very much. Here's the film. Based on the novel by H.G. Wells, the winner of the Academy Award for Best Special Effects from 1953, produced by George Pal, The War of the Worlds. Joining me once again to discuss The War of the Worlds is writer, director, producer Frank Darabont. Frank, welcome back. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I find the end here both incredibly cool and slightly frustrating. I mean, it is cool, as they say, that the Martians are felled by the littlest thing, the littlest parts of humanity. But it is like they're out here to destroy the world, and they got strep throat, so we're all fine.
Well, that goes back to Wells.
Right.
That goes back to Wells, and it felt very legitimate. In his novel. In a movie, you kind of the more advanced we get in our understanding of things, you do have to ask yourself the question. And in the remake, we had to ask the same question, which was, okay, they're sophisticated enough to come to our planet and start blowing the heck out of things, but they didn't think ahead that maybe microbes would be a problem.
You'd mentioned that George Pal and the director Byron Haskin had to adapt. They couldn't quite create the Martian war machine as Wells had described it, but they came up with something essentially just as effective. There, in fact, is one line in the movie from Gene Barry where he says, there's one of those machines is out there like standing right next to us. Mm-hmm. So when they shot that, the plan was still to have them the way you see it in the remake on the stilts.
Well, when they first come out of the pit, you see these little beams that are hinting, and he goes, they're like invisible legs. It's like a magnetic whatever gobbledygook explanation he came up with. But I thought that was interesting. It's like they had to recreate the idea of these machines entirely, and yet they didn't entirely let go of the idea of having a tripod. They just made them invisible ones, and they did a little effect of magnetic energy. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I
think you'll relate to this part. So it turned out, as they start production here, that they only had the rights, not to Wells's novel, but really to DeMille's silent version, which never got made. So they didn't have sound rights.
Oh my gosh.
So they had to go back to Wells's family to make sure that they could make the movie with sound, and he's got a little extra money for it.
Well, good. The family should have, for sure.
But it's just like, I read that and I thought, man, you have no idea the things that come up when making a movie that get in the way to getting the movie made.
Oh boy, you just said a mouthful. Oh, for sure. I hope somebody one of these days will do Wells's time period. I would love to see the War of the Worlds set in the late 19th century when you've got, light horse cavalry doing charges, and it's not contemporary military hardware being used.
Right, it's in late 19th century.
It's late 19th. Boy, would that be cool. And I know there have been some very low budget attempts by, independent filmmakers, but I'd love to see the one where you get the power of a studio and the top line effects work that would entail.
If only there were a writer, director, producer who was a huge sci-fi fan.
If only.
I can't think of anybody who would be good to write and direct that. But Frank, I will keep thinking, and if I come up with anyone,
let me know.
So make it, man.
Okay, all right, good. All right. Good. Start calling the studios tomorrow. We'll pitch it together.
Frank, great stuff. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Don't go away. Frank and I will return momentarily with another sci-fi classic, this one from 1956, Forbidden Planet.